Okay, welcome everyone to our Viz Tool webinar. We're going to go ahead and get started. So on the webinar today, we have myself. I'm Erin Postumus, the Outreach Coordinator here at the USA National Phenology Network. We also have Kathy Gerst, our Data Product Coordinator, and Jeff Switzer, our Systems Analyst, who has done a lot of the work on developing and creating this tool. So what we're going to be talking about today is the visualization tool. We're going to give you a little overview on how the tool works and show you how to access it in different ways. So some of you might have been able to explore the tool a little bit so far, and you probably noticed that it looks quite different from our old tool. Our old tool was actually in operation from 2015 up until the end of last year. And we still have that old tool available if you want to keep using that. We'll be retiring it at the end of this year. And we're hoping that our new tool will provide a much easier user experience and an easier way to really get into the interesting seasonal happenings about phenology. So when you open up the tool, you'll see that we have a number of different seasonal stories. Those are these 6 panels here. And we created those with the intention of providing some curated examples that will allow you to learn how to use the different visualizations that we have available, and also provide you some guidance on how you can change those to explore different aspects of phenology of plants and animals. So I'm going to be going through each of those today and showing you how to use those different types of visualizations. But I also wanted to point out, just in an overview of the tool, that we also have this section called the Data Explorer. And that's actually meant to provide you a way to get right into looking at the data. So if you already know the kind of data that you want to look at, the species of interest, you can go right there and start exploring. We also have a settings button, and that at the moment only includes the ability to change in between common name and scientific name. We might add other features there in the future. So let's start out by looking at the first of our seasonal stories. So this is how fast is it warming up this year where I live. So this actually allows you to type in your zip code. So I'm going to type in the zip code here in Tucson where I live and click See Visualization. So with each of these seasonal stories, we've provided a little bit of text guidance to help you understand what you're looking at. So each of these has a what am I looking at section, what does this tell me section, how can I modify this graph? And that's really meant to help you play with the different features and the settings to explore your own data that you're interested in. You can minimize this by clicking the little hide description button there. So what we're looking at here is the accumulated growing degree days, and that might not be something that you've heard of before, but basically it's just the amount of heat that has accumulated since the beginning of the year on January 1st. And so these lines represent how much heat has accumulated in different years. The black line shows you how much heat accumulated over a 30-year average, and the average we're talking about is 1981 to 2010. The blue line shows you the current year, so it's showing you how much heat has accumulated this year in 2020. The yellow line is showing you last year to just give you a comparison of what last year might have been. You might remember what that was, and so it provides just a comparison just from last year to this year. And then we also have the red line here that shows the forecasted amount of heat that is predicted to occur over the next 6 days. So if you look here, for Tucson, 85719, the zip code, we actually are pretty on schedule compared to a longer term average. If you hover over the graph, you can see different values coming up in the top left of the screen there. And that's telling you what's the difference in the amount of growing degree days, and then what does that translate to in terms of days? How far ahead or behind are we? So it's not too interesting in Tucson. We're pretty average for this year. If you want to change the features, you can do that in the panel here on the left. So if we open that, we can get a longer view of a different number of days. So that's now showing us January 1st until mid-March. We can also change this threshold, which is the green horizontal line. So it might be that you know of a certain threshold of interest. Maybe that has to do with a phenology life cycle event or some sort of a timing for crop. You can actually change that to see where you're at in respect to that line. You can also remove last year by unclicking the box here. We can also change the location that we're looking at by going to Layer Point on the left menu. So this will bring up a map, and this is actually showing the accumulated growing degree days across the whole country. And our pin is where I put in for the zip code. So we can switch it to, say, look at somewhere in the Midwest. We can switch it to Michigan. And then when we go to next, then that will update and show us the amount of heat that's accumulated there. So this is quite a different story than in Tucson. We can see that the blue line for this year is showing that they're quite ahead of average for the amount of heat that's been accumulated. There was a jump back here in the middle of January. And as for the prediction for the forecast over the next week, it's pretty flat. So they're really not going to accumulate much heat over the next week. You can also share this visualization with others. So if you click on the link here on the left to copy the link to the clipboard, you can have that sent in an email, send that to someone else, and it will come up with the same visualization that you were looking at. You can also bookmark it if you want to save your progress, and if it's a visualization you want to get back to by just saving the bookmark for the URL. So our next visualization is called an activity curve. And this one here is an example of looking at milkweed flowers and monarchs. So again, we have a little description about what you're looking at and what you can learn from this visualization, as well as the different ways to modify it. So the strengths of an activity curve are being able to look at the overlap between different species. So here we plotted two species that depend on each other. So we have milkweed flowers as well as monarch butterflies. A new improvement for this tool is that we're able to look at higher classifications above species. So you can see we're actually looking at the dogbane family, that's the milkweed family. And we can look at that, or we can look at different taxa. So if we click on the curves menu on the left, we can actually change that from looking at the taxonomic rank of family to something either higher or lower. You can go up to class, and you can go all the way down to species, which is the level that the old tool uses. So if we want to, for example, just look at one of the milkweeds, we can change the taxonomic rank to species, choose common milkweed, and then select the Pheno phase of interest, which is open flowers, and then that will update. The activity curves have different metrics that you can look at. So if we click here, the one that we selected is the proportion of individuals with yes records, but we can also do the total yes records. And this might be useful for places where you think that there's pretty consistent data collection, because this actually can be pretty biased if you have more observer effort at different times of the year. So let's say there was a thing that you're looking at, some phenophase of interest, and in the summer months, the activity tapers off because people are going on vacation or the students are on break and they're not reporting as often. That's going to maybe be reflected in the data by the total number of yes records declining, not because the phenophase wasn't there, but because the effort wasn't there on the part of the observers. So that's why we offer the proportion of yes records, which looks at out of all of the yes and no records, how many of those were yeses. And then we also have the option to look at individual plants, which is, let's say there was an observer that went out 3 times in a 2-week period. If you have the proportion of yes records, you're going to count that as 3 yeses. Whereas if you're looking at the individual plant, it's going to translate those 3 yeses for that plant to just a single yes, saying, yes, that plant was active during that period. For animals, the metrics are a little bit different. So we can choose from the same as the plants, we can look at total yes records as well as the proportion of yeses. We can also look at the total sites. So it's different than plants because we don't actually have you observe individual animals because we can't tell that they're the same individuals as we can with plants. So we're looking at animals at the site level. So these are basically the same options as for plants for looking at individual plants. And then we also have the some of the metrics that come from looking at abundance of animals. So if you observe animals through Nature's Notebook, you might notice that you can sometimes report the number that you see in addition to saying a yes or no. So that is reflected in the total animals here. That would be just the raw number added up over that whole period. You can also do animals in phase, which is the mean number of animals over the period. And then we have a couple other metrics that we created. One is actually including the amount of time that the observer spent observing. So that's taking the number of animals divided by the time spent. And then we also have, for people that also report the size of their site, we've also divided it by acre. So you'll notice that as you select these different metrics, you might have a lower sample size for those just because there aren't as many people that both report the time that they spend observing as well as the size of their site. You'll also notice that for these activity curves, there are only two different metrics that you can select because there's only two different axes that we can plot things on here, on the left and on the right. So if you were to add a curve, which you can, you could select, say, a different year that you wanted to add. Maybe you wanted to look at common milkweeds in 2018 as well as in 2019. We'll select, oh, it didn't take. Common milkweed and open flowers. We can make it a different color so that it's a little bit easier to see. We can also, on the activity curves, play with the date interval. So right now it's set for this seasonal story to be a bi-weekly, and you can change that to look at monthly, which is summarizing this information over a month period instead of 2 weeks. We can also change it to weekly, so this is summarizing over just a week. You can also remove the data points on the graphs, and you can change the shape of the graphs to either be smoothed or straight lines. You can also change the boundary that's included in this visualization, so that's also on the left here. Right now we're looking at a hand-drawn boundary that includes the Midwest. If we want to remove that, we can do that by taking off the boundary, and then we can add on a different hand-drawn boundary and draw a different shape around an area of interest. And that will recalculate the visualization that we're looking at. We can also use predefined boundaries. So we could take off the hand-drawn boundary and add on, for example, a state boundary. So again, you can share this visualization by copying the link to your clipboard. And another option is you can also export the data. So if you were exploring the different visualizations and you decided that you wanted to download these data as an Excel file, we also have this button here to export the data. It'll take you to our Phenology observation portal, and then you have different options of the different types of data that you can download based on those filters that you already put in on the tool. So it's preset for the date from 2018 to the end of 2019 with the two different species of interest. And if you're curious about these different types of data that you can download, you can click on each one and get a description of what those are. Okay, let's move on to the next visualization. We also have a scatter plot option. For this example, we're looking at leafing in the soapberry family, and we're looking at data from 2010 to 2019. Our scatter plots let you compare the onsets of different phenophases with different variables. We'll give it a minute to load. So basically the onset will be the first yes that someone reported for either an individual plant or for all of the plants at their site for a year for a given phenophase. So for this example, we're looking at the onset of leafing. So this is when observers first reported a yes for leafing at their site for those years of 2010 to 2019. And this is actually a seasonal story that includes data from across the whole country. So that's why it's taking a little bit of time to load, because there are a lot of different options here. So each of these points represents the onset of leafing for a particular plant at a given site. We also have a line on here that represents the relationship between the onset of that leafing phenophase compared to the minimum temperature from the previous winter. So sometimes the graph can get a little bit hidden behind the panel. So if you click one of these options here, anything in the panel and then collapse it down again, it'll kind of refit to the screen. And then you can see the left axis as well. So we have onset day of year on the y-axis and then T-min winter on the x-axis. And we can see the relationship here where if you have a warmer winter, you generally have an earlier onset of leafing, which is what we would expect. So we have a number of different features here in that feature menu. You can change the different variable that you're looking at. Maybe you want to look at a different climate variable. You could look at day length, accumulated growing degree days. We could also look at latitude, elevation, and you can just switch in between those and all the other settings will remain the same. You can remove the fit line from the screen. And then you can also switch in between looking at the onset for individual plants versus the onsets over the site as a whole. So if someone has a number of different plants of that species or that family or whichever taxa you're looking at, if you take off individual phenometrics, it will summarize the whole site for you. So it'll give you a single value for the site. That's an average of all of the individual plants. And that will probably take a minute to load as well because it's recalculating everything. Another new feature that we have on the tool is the ability to restrict the dates that you are looking at on this curve. So it's a really great way to restrict the data to just the seasons that you're interested in. So if we're looking at leafing or even leaf out, you might only really be interested in the beginning part of the year. And sometimes there are observations where people might have been a little bit confused about what is a breaking leaf bud, or maybe people started reporting later in the year and they didn't catch those first onsets. So their first yeses represent something that they just happened to see in the summer because they weren't observing in the spring. You can get rid of those data by just truncating the date range here. So as I move this, it'll show more days of the year or less, depending on how you move it. And you can move both ends. You can also change the years that you're looking at here in the date range. So you could change from 2010 to say, I only want to look at years from 2013 to 2019, and it'll restrict to those years. There's also a data precision filter. So that is looking at the number of days that were in between the last no that was reported and the first yes. So with Nature's Notebook, we ask observers to go out and report either they did or they did not see a particular phenophase. So this data precision filter will allow you to say, I only want to see observations where there was a no within a certain number of days before that first yes onset. So we can change it to none, where we don't have individual phenometrics checked, so we can't do that. If we check individual phenometrics, we can choose none, and then our other options are 7, 14, and 30. So if you have 30 days, that would be the longest number of days. So anyone who observed and said a no within 30 days of that yes, it'll show you all of those onsets. If you want to make it more restricted, then you could choose 7, and that means that an observer went out a week before they saw the first yes and said no. So that gives you an idea that that onset occurred within a week's time rather than 30 days time. Our next visualization is looking at the arrival of spring onset. So this is based on our spring indices, which are an indicator of when spring arrived in early season plants. And if you'd like more information about those, we actually have a link in the visualization description here to a page that will give you a description of how those indices were created and how you can use them to see, get an idea of when spring has arrived at a particular location. So this is looking at the current year here at today, February 5th. And we can see that for much of the country, we're seeing that the arrival of spring leaf onset is earlier compared to a long-term average. So most of the areas here in the Southwest are a red color to a dark red, and that's indicating that spring arrived earlier than a long-term average. And again, it's the average of 1981 to 2010. We're able to zoom in on the map and get a better idea of the arrival of spring. You can actually click on the map to get the actual value of the number of days early for a particular pixel of interest. And then you can also change the layer that you're looking at here in the base layer menu. So we're looking at the anomaly, which means the comparison of the current year to the long-term average. But we can also look at, say, the current year, which is showing us the date that that pixel reached the requirements for spring leaf out on the map here. So if we click now on the map, we can see that the date that that pixel reached the requirements for spring leaf out was on January 15th. You can also add on species phenophase data on top of this map. And this will just let you see when the onset dates were for different species of interest compared to the spring index. So for example, we could plot red maple, which actually has flowers before it has leaves. So we could plot open flowers of red maple and see how that lines up with the onset of spring. And so this is using the same legend where we have the dates for the onset of spring leaf out, as well as the onsets that Nature's Notebook observers reported for red maple flowers. And if you click on those points, you can see the actual date that those were reported and the location and then the name of the site. You can change to other types of layers as well, in addition to the spring indices. So we also have the daily temperature accumulations, which is what we looked at in the first example with the accumulated growing degree days. However, it doesn't make too much sense to compare the species phenophases on top of a different layer besides the spring index because there's a different legend that's used for the accumulated growing degree days. So now you'll see that those points are no longer filled in because the legends don't match. So we're looking at just the accumulated growing degree days, the colors correspond to the legend here. And then the points still show where people have reported red maple flowering, but it doesn't line up with the same colors. Our next visualization is a phenology calendar. So the calendars will show you the presence or absence of a particular phenophase for a species or a higher taxa. And so this is when an observer reported a yes or a no for a given species and phenophase combination. Or in this case, we're looking at different genera of nectar plants that are important for pollinators. So we have 2 different years represented on this calendar for 3 different genera. The first one is milkweeds here, and these are using the scientific names. And then we are looking at the phenophase of open flowers for these different genera here. So we have two different colors plotted on here for each of the lines. So we have the gray lines, which indicate a no observation. So that's when an observer went out and they did not see that phenophase, so they reported a no. We also have the colored lines, and those represent when an observer went out and they reported a yes. If you had two different observers in different locations on the same day, it's going to show a yes if one of them reported a yes. That will overshadow the no. The blank spaces are when we didn't have an observer go out, so we don't know whether it was a yes or no. If that seems kind of visually overwhelming, there's an option to take off the negative data. So that will show you just the yes observations that were reported. You can also play around with the different band sizes and the label sizes to make it a little bit easier to see. So as with the other visualizations, we can change the years from here. So we could remove a year to only look at 2019. We could add on 2010 or 2020 or a different year here. We can also update the different, here it's the genus and then the phenophase class of open flowers to change those if we want. We could remove one of the different combinations here. We can also update the boundary. So this one does not have a boundary set. So if we wanted to add one, we could do a hand-drawn boundary and say, put a box around a certain part of the country. And while that's updating, again, you can share this by copying the link to the clipboard and then export the visualization data, and that will open the Phenology observation portal if you wanted to download an Excel file of these data. Okay, we're gonna go back to another one now instead of waiting for that. Okay, our last visualization is our Pheno forecast. So this is another one of our map options. In this example, we're looking at a forecast of when eastern tent caterpillars were active last year. So if you haven't seen our Pheno forecast, these are maps of insect pests, and we have one invasive plant, and it's showing you when we expect the activity of that particular species to happen based on what we know about either the amount of temperature or the amount of precipitation that's required for them to change from one life cycle stage to another. So for these insects, such as the eastern tent caterpillar, we know that when they get to a certain amount of growing degree days, one of the life cycles will change. So in this case, we'll see emergence of caterpillars once accumulated growing degree days get to 90. And then once it gets to 191, then we start to see that activity decline. So these different bands correspond to places in the country that as of March 10th last year had reached those different stages across the range of the caterpillars. So this gives an idea to managers or other people that are concerned with eastern tent caterpillars when they can expect to see the activity of this insect of interest. So we also have a notification system where people can sign up and they can get a notification 2 weeks and then 1 week before activity is expected at their location. And that's those notifications are based on zip codes. If we change this to look at this year, we won't see anything for this species because this species actually doesn't start to accumulate any temperature until March 1st. So these models are a little bit different. The threshold starts March 1st instead of January 1st. But if we look at a different example like emerald ash borer for this year, we can see that there are locations that have reached the time for adult emergence based on the amount of temperature accumulated. So we can expect to start seeing adult emergence in those locations that are yellow on the map. And again, you can plot the species and phenophase information on top of this map if it makes sense. I don't think we have any reports of emerald ash borer. If we did, we'd see them in the list. So we don't have any Nature's Notebook observers that have reported that species yet, but if we did, we would be able to overlay those points on top of the map. So maybe in the coming months, as the activity moves up the country into places where we have more observers, we might start to see those data as well. So again, you can change the different species here in the list and change in between which map you're looking at by the base layer menu. We also have forecasts available for these maps. So we're looking at the current day, but we can also look at up to February 11th to see if activity is starting. So for apple maggot, we weren't seeing activity today, but in a week's time, we're going to start to see that it's getting closer to when we can start seeing adults of apple maggot. So I also wanted to show you how you can just go right into looking at the data through the Data Explorer tool. So if you know that you're interested in a particular species, or if you just want to know what's happening at my location, you can look at the Data Explorer. And the first option you'll have is what kind of visualization you want to use. So we've already gone through all of these different visualizations. We looked at the time series, the phenology calendar, the activity curve, the scatter plot, and then 2 examples of the map. We looked at the spring index map and then the accumulated growing degree day map. Oh, and also the Pheno forecast map. But we can also put a map where there's no base layer. So I wanted to show that. So this would mean that you don't choose a base layer, you just have none selected there. And you can pick a particular area of interest. You can highlight, a part of the country by doing a predefined or a hand-drawn boundary, but you don't have to do that if you don't want to. You'll pick your year of interest, and then you can plot the onsets of different species, and that will show you when those things occurred at different sites across the country. So I'm going to change this to look at order. And then butterflies. So because we have these higher taxonomic groups, it'll allow you to group all of the data for these different species. So you might not know which species has been active so far, so you just want to look at a bigger category. And then active individuals, and then let's also add, let's say, class, and look at flowering plants, and then open flowers. And then we can see where people have reported those so far across the country this year. So now these different colors of the squares and the triangles line up with that legend on the bottom, which is when was the first occurrence of that species in that phenophase at different sites. And then your legend for the different shapes is over on the left. So we have the triangles represent butterflies and moths, and then the squares represent the flowering plants. So I also wanted to show a couple other ways for you to access data in the tool. One of these is if you want to look at your own data that you've collected through Nature's Notebook. So the way to do this is to start out on the Nature's Notebook homepage. There's a link at the top here to get to your observation deck. And if you're not logged in, then it'll prompt you to do that. Okay, so it's prompting me to log in. So if you scroll down to the bottom of your observation deck, you'll see this area that says Enter Observations. There's a new link here that says Visualize My Data. So if I click on that, that will open the tool and it'll be pre-filtered with just looking at my data. So collected by me as a particular person ID in our database. So again, I can select the visualization that I want, and then on the left, you can see that my user ID is preset to data that I have collected. And this is actually going to be data that I've collected at my own personal sites, as well as the data that I've collected for any local phenology program sites. It won't show me other data from those other people that are part of that group, but just the observations that I personally submitted. If you're part of a local phenology program, you can actually get right to looking at your own group's data in the visualization tool by going to active local phenology programs. So this is a list that we're still updating. So if you have a local phenology program, please check out this list and see if your group is on here. And if it's not, let us know. And if your group is on here, but it doesn't have a description, then also let us know, because we can put a paragraph here that describes who your group is and what you're doing. But you'll notice for each of these groups, we have a link that says visualize this LPP's data. Activity curve. I don't need to worry about the boundary. It'll give me the options to select from the species that they are observing. So in 2010, they've observed 24 different species. I can see that in the little parentheses here. And I can select from the list that they have been observing and plot those data. And then it's easy to change in between different visualizations and then look at different data here. Again, add the pheno phase, you can pick the color, and then add those to the visualization. Another way that you can, if you're a local phenology program, get into the local phenology program data in the visualization tool is through the managed users. So this is a page that is a kind of a hub for people that are group administrators. And so there's another way there where you can get to visualize your group data. So then that would be preloaded with the group that I had selected, which is the NCO. So those are the different features that I wanted to highlight today. And there's probably been some questions, so we can move on to those and then hopefully look at some other parts of the tool. Okay, so one person asked about whether we can change the base temperature. And this is referring to our accumulated growing degree day maps. So I'm gonna start from the homepage of the tool to show you how you would do that. So because we know that we're looking at accumulated growing degree days, the different ways you could get there would be either you type in your zip code if you're interested in your personal location, or you could go right to the Data Explorer and get to it that way. So we want to choose a map first. That's the type of visualization. We would choose the daily temperature accumulations. And then we have different options for the layers here. So we can look at the long-term average, the current day, and the daily anomaly. And then this is where you would change the degree base. So we currently have just these two options. These are kind of the standard options that people are mostly concerned about, freezing temperatures, and then 50 is often used for insect activity. So we can alternate in between those two. Any other questions? Okay, another person asked, can you see where the weather data are coming from in the growing degree days visualization? So we have some more information about the how the maps are created when you go to the seasonal story. For this one, how fast is it warming up? So let's go back and look at that. So in the description here, we have a link to the growing degree days page. And that page will give a description of what's behind the maps and give you more information about the sources of data. So I think the easiest way to find that would be, it's the GeoServer documentation lists all of the different data products, right? They go into the maps.
It's right here under daily. Under additional documents.
Yeah, so probably either the GeoServer documentation or this info sheet here would be the best source of the data. But you can see the list here of the different data types that go into that. They're mostly from NOAA's different weather data products. Yeah, so another question was, are there options for other entries, maybe? For instance, can another tree be entered other than soapberry? So yeah, for all of the visualizations, you can add multiple species at a time, and you can change if you start out with one of the seasonal stories, say for soapberry, you can update the species that you're looking at. So you would just go to species phenophase here, and then you could change, if you know that there's a particular species in that family that you're interested in, then you would just click, it's gonna have to load first, but under the taxonomic rank, you would change that from family to species, and then you would select species from the list, or you can just click this box for under, it would say species, and then start typing in the name, and then you could select it from the list, as long as there were data available in collected through Nature's Notebook. Okay, other questions? AGDD, is this in degree Fahrenheit or degrees Celsius, since the other temperature values are on degrees Celsius? Yeah, so let's go back and look at the accumulated growing degree day map one more time. So yeah, we probably should add that. I think it's on the time series, that very first visualization we looked at. I think it says Fahrenheit, but yeah, we should add that on here to make sure that people know that. So that's good feedback. It does say it in the description here that the accumulated growing degree day values are calculated in Fahrenheit, but yeah, we could add that onto the maps as well. Is there an easy way to see a map of the sources of phenology data? So that's an interesting question. This is actually something that we moved away from a little bit from something that was in the old tool. So in the old tool, it was more based on seeing where the data were on the map first, and then going through your options to make a visualization. And we felt like it was more, it was an easy user experience to have people start out with knowing what visualization type they wanted first, and then guiding people through selecting, let's say if you're looking at an activity curve, selecting the location, and then what species and phenophases that you're interested in looking at. So you do have the option of drawing a boundary around a particular area, but you aren't first informed about where the data are on the map. And so we realize that is a limitation in the way the new tool works, but we're actually hoping that this will be something that we can include on the Phenology observation portal, which is that other tool where you can download the Excel file, because that would be a better place if you really wanted to know, how much data are in a particular place, because you're ready to analyze the data, then that would be a better place for them. But here it's really just an exploration of what are the kind of the patterns that we're seeing in the data, and not so much about how many different sites are there. You can get some of that information from the legends on the different curves. So for example, with the activity curves, if you were to plot something on here, like, let's see, like say if we put red maple on here, then when you hover over the graph, you do get some information about how many records are on there in the legend. So it tells you that the number is 493. So you get a little bit of a sense of how much data are behind the maps. It just doesn't show you exactly where they are. You can have the boundary on the map to restrict your area of interest, but you won't see the points on the map unless you go to first the map and then plot those onset dates, and that would give you a little bit better idea about where the data are coming from. So another question about changing in between common name and scientific name. So you can do that on the settings menu here. And there's just a toggle to switch back and forth in between them. Any other questions? Okay, there's one more question coming, it sounds like. Another question, can you just type in a zip code for a predefined boundary? So I think this is asking about if you wanted to have, say, a polygon on the map that was for a particular zip code of interest, can you do that? No, you can't. So that would be something that you would select if you were looking at, actually, let me go into a visualization. So if you wanted to change the boundary, we do have some predefined boundaries here, which are an alternative to the hand-drawn boundary. So if we were going to do that, we could add zip code here. We don't have that functionality yet, but if it's something that people are really interested in, we could think about that in the future. But right now, we only have US states, and then we have, for some of our Department of the Interior partners like the Fish and Wildlife and the Forest Service and the National Park Service, we have their regions. Okay, I think that's all the questions. So I just wanted to share, let's see, our contact information in case you have any follow-up questions, or as you're exploring the tool, if you come up with something where you need to ask us about it, I put my contact information here. Feel free to email me or you can call me. And then we also have the support email as well on here if you'd like to get in touch with us that way. But thank you so much for attending, and we will be sending out the recording link soon. You'll get a follow-up email tomorrow that will again have the contact information if you have follow-up questions. And then we should be getting the recording posted on the landing page for the Viz tool, which will be linked in the email tomorrow, as well as on our YouTube channel in the next few days. So thank you all for joining, and I hope you have a great rest of your week.